Hello, we're in Brisbane, and this is a follow-up to the low carb down under events that we've been attending all week. And I'm in the presence of some engineers. And to my right is Simon Saunders, who is a systems engineer. And we also have Marty Kendall, and you are a civil engineer. And I thought we'd sit down and talk a little bit about metabolic health.
As we do.
Yeah, so Marty, let's talk about you first. So you have a website called Optimizing Nutrition. And I was hoping that you could explain to us, as an engineer, how you got into nutrition. But I just first want to say that what I understand about optimizing nutrition is that there's three pillars that need to be addressed when it comes to health. And I've referred to them as knobs on a amplifier.
Yep. Yeah.
So we have the bass, we have mid-level, and we have the treble. So they represent insulin load, nutrient density, and fat density,
or fat, energy density.
Energy density. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I suppose I got interested in nutrition. Wife being a type 1, so it's sort of personal, and family history of type 2 and obesity. So getting into it, I thought, well, what is it that raises insulin? What is it that raises blood sugar, and how do we manage that? So I dug into it a little bit more, and came across this data at University of Sydney that the food insulin index data, so rather than the glycemic index that shows you how much your blood sugar raises based on a particular food, the insulin index data demonstrates how much your insulin rises over a period of time, and the area under the curve for different foods. So it's a really useful way of understanding the insulin response to different foods.
So wasn't that index developed by somebody from Sydney?
Yeah, Jane Miller and Suzanne Holt from University of Sydney about 20 years ago, and did some really great work when they were looking back then at the satiety index, the glycemic index, and the insulin index. And I came across the insulin index data and thought, this is a gold mine. I need to get it out there and share it a little bit more. And there wasn't a lot of data for quite a while, but more recently a lot more is being compiled, and there's 147 different data points. And being an engineer, I thought, hey, I can throw it into my spreadsheet and see which factors, which parameters of our food relate best to the insulin response of our food.
Yeah, so a lot of times we see people, they're just focusing on weight loss, or they're insulin resistant, and so they go and just turn down that insulin load.
And it's all about insulin for a lot of people, and it's very important.
Yes, it is, but they sometimes negate the rest of it. So they're forgetting about nutrient density. Yeah, and
Yeah, I suppose I looked at the foods that have the lowest insulin load, the purified fats, butter, olive oil, peanut butter, all these great foods that we all, as low carbers, sort of enjoy to an extent, but they don't contain the full spectrum of nutrients, of vitamins, minerals, aminos, and essential fatty acids. So I thought, well, maybe there's a way of combining nutrient density with the insulin index or insulin load concepts to optimize nutrition for a particular situation.
So there are some situations where you can minimize insulin load while optimizing nutrient density, perhaps.
Yeah. I think particularly for people who are chasing therapeutic ketosis for cancer and epilepsy and dementia, it's really useful to really minimize the insulin load of your food while also at the same time maximizing nutrient density as much as you can. But these people legitimately do need a low insulin load. But as you get better metabolic health, for someone maybe who's trying to manage their diabetes, they can focus more on nutrient density and a little bit less on insulin load. And as you improve to someone who's really metabolically healthy, then you can maximize nutrient density, and perhaps someone who's focusing on weight loss is actually insulin sensitive. They just need to cut back on the energy density, which is the third parameter that you can manipulate once you've achieved that insulin sensitivity.
That's calories, is energy density, just to simplify.
Yeah, I suppose it's the calories per weight of food. So that the low energy density foods are things like celery or whatever that have incredibly they've got a lot of nutrients but not a lot of calories, so they'll fill you up very quickly. And they typically have a lot of water, a lot of fibre, but not really high fat, potentially. So dropping back on that fat content, dropping back on the energy density when you're insulin sensitive allows your body fat to be used as the fat in a ketogenic, high fat diet, but the fat's coming from your body.
So a consensus here, perhaps, just to simplify it, that eating less long-term, reducing energy density is probably a way to longevity and metabolic health.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people agree that dropping calories and minimizing calories is important, but it works in yeast cells and mice and monkeys in labs, but often it doesn't work long term in real life, in real people who have access to food, not real food potentially, and it's easy to get that. So we have to swing potentially the sort of the optimizing.
Well, the idea, if you're addressing insulin and nutrients and you're doing that right, the energy might take care of itself.
Yeah, a lot of the time, if you focus on the most nutrient dense foods, you're able to more easily auto-regulate your appetite.
Okay. Well, I know that you and Simon have been collaborating, and Simon's wife, in the last several months, and they've been some of the data points in there. We'll talk
Very
about
informative,
that. We'll talk about that in a minute, and to see if Simon is applying some of these skills on his own, or if he's come up with some of his own crazy ideas. So, talk about yourself, Simon.
Myself.
Yeah, your background and how you got interested in nutrition, and you have a great personal story to share with us.
Yeah. My personal story is I was a chubby kid growing up. Always found it difficult to sort of lose weight, and I did the typical thing that most people did back in the 80s, which was Weight Watchers, gained most of my weight, and would save all my Weight Watchers points at the time for bread and high glycemic foods. And then I discovered a different sort of diet that was much lower in carbohydrate, and it was working. The first time I was introduced to the concept of giving up bread, I said, no, not doing that. I love bread too much. I can do that with eating bread. But nothing was working, and then I eventually dialed that down, and then I wanted to understand why did that work. And then I started linking up about the insulin, and then every single other diet that was out there all started linking in one form of another, very, very similar thread. But what got me very, very interested, or as time went on, as I dialed all them in with the lower insulin, and the nutrient density really started taking off. So I was aiming for lots of green leafy vegetables and other things. I eventually was able to lose just over 100 pounds.
Yeah, kilos? 50?
And in kilos, it's 47.
47. Yeah. So this was in 2014.
2014 was when I started. I was at my largest, which I think was close to 240 pounds. I forget the exact number.
No, 280.
280,
You were 280, went down, and we're about the same weight now. We're, 170 pounds, 77 kilos.
Yeah, 77 kilos.
Yeah, we're exactly the same weight. So
hard to believe, eh?
Twinsies.
Yeah, I mean,
in less than 2 years.
It's amazing.
So, November will be 2 years when I started that. But what got me very interested in the higher insulin load and the metabolic effects of what high levels of insulin does is my wife. And that's what got me very chatting a lot with Marty, because my data sets were extremely different than what my wife's data sets were on a very similar nutrient diet, very similar low insulin load. And the data points that my wife had told a very different story when Marty chucked them into a spreadsheet. Did you want to explain what you found?
Yeah, I suppose been playing with our different people's ketone versus glucose data. So what you see is someone who is insulin sensitive can easily release ketones from their body fat when they don't get the glucose, don't get food. So all of a sudden the appetite is easily regulated because they can access their own body fat for energy.
Is that's someone who's metabolically healthy?
Yeah,
perhaps?
fairly healthy. Yeah.
Insulin sensitive.
Insulin sensitive. So they've got lower levels of insulin circulating, so they can easily access their body fat stores. But someone who's insulin resistant, say type 2 diabetic, has very high glucose levels, but when they don't eat, their ketones don't kick in and their blood sugars drop and they feel really bad and all of a sudden they have to eat again. So regardless of calories in, calories out, they get their appetite is uncontrollable.
So Simon's wife, what's her name again?
Miriam.
Miriam.
Oh, Mim.
Mim.
Sorry, Mim.
Mim. Okay.
Okay, in trouble.
Mim.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Mim is highly insulin resistant, is what the data show.
Yeah. I suppose that you've got the type 2 diabetic who has high blood sugars and can't produce ketones. You've got someone who's insulin sensitive who can easily produce ketones and keeps a very low blood sugars. But when we looked at Mim's data compared to everybody else, she had very, very low glucose and ketones. So really she's not able to produce enough energy to feel good and, be active.
And
so.
hyperinsulinemic is what you inferred from all this.
Oh,
Although you weren't measuring insulin, perhaps.
No,
Yes.
but the ketone and glucose sort of indicates that, and Simon's gone down the rabbit hole trying to understand what it is that's driving that and how to potentially help his wife.
Yeah. So her approach is perhaps a little bit different than what you've been doing.
Very different.
And if we have time, we might talk about Mim a little bit more, but maybe we could focus on you a little bit, Simon. So you're on the opposite spectrum.
Very
so
opposite.
even though you had a weight issue, you were actually insulin sensitive.
Yeah, very. I can
And-
easily access that.
And metabolically healthy.
Yeah. Well, that's what you inferred from my data,
Oh,
didn't you?
You weren't sick, you were
No.
30, early 30s and very obese, but still doing quite well. But it seems that someone who's insulin sensitive can actually gain weight very easily because they can pack on the muscle, but once they finish packing on the muscle, they pack on the fat in a poor food environment. But when he actually, I think initially you dropped your carbs and things went well, but you got to a point where you had to actually start moderating back the fat.
Yes.
So you worked out how to keep your insulin low enough, and then moderated back your fat.
Yep.
And then the body fat could be flushed, so you lost weight very, very quickly.
Yeah.
So I think it's really a great example for people to learn from, because we just assume if you have a weight issue that you're highly insulin resistant, and that's not always the case.
Yeah.
No, there's many variables in many different states.
Yeah, so you're insulin sensitive. So take us through what you've done in the past 2 years, how you've kind of tweaked everything and achieved, basically you've achieved your goal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it sort of went into 3 different gears. The first one, I wasn't as involved in the new social community that was coming out. So I did what I thought worked. So I lowered my carbohydrates down, I kept my proteins moderate, never went crazy, and I kept my fats on the lower end of the scale at the time. And I dropped about 30 kilos during that time, which is about 60 pounds, just over 60 pounds within a period of a few months. And then I started discovering the wider low-carb movement that had extended out, mainly because I started testing blood ketones. And it wasn't at a very high level. It was still at a very low level, even though I was losing the weight. And it didn't feel sustainable. I was waiting till I'd finished so I can start eating a little bit of normal food again. And then I started dialing in my ketone levels by making sure the proteins were at the right point, the fats were at a similar point, and then my body started producing a lot more ketones, and I felt fantastic. And it's like a light switch went on in my brain, and I go, oh, this is how this can be a sustainable energy source in a wholly different gear that I never discovered before. And then I started writing my blog, even though I never shared much about myself. I just shared the interesting news articles, but I was confident that I'd found something that was real. And as I went through, I listened to the community, did all different things because I wanted to see if what people were saying was true.
So many different voices in the community that can be completely confusing, and you basically tried them all.
Yeah, I had fun. I tried Keitha's Carb Night Solution and cycled my carbs in a week. With that experiment for a few months, I found I could maybe lose 0.2 of a kilo every month. My body became a bit more metabolically flexible, where I would enter into ketosis faster after each week, so it was like a muscle. So I discovered different lessons along the way. Others said that you need to have more fats to lose more fats, to try a harder method. So I upped my fats and my weight still stayed the same, and that's how it worked for me. And I go, yep, that's fine. I still felt good, still felt fine. Was jamming in the sour cream from Professor Dom's high fat ice cream that he makes. That was really nice, actually. And lots of macadamia nuts. Love macadamia nuts. And then later I thought, what if there was some thing to what I used to do that made the weight fall very fast in the initial 3 months? So I optimized it. I was using Marty's lists, funnily enough, for just making sure I was hitting the most nutrient-dense foods and the lower insulin index, because I had already had worked out what sort of I needed a certain amount of vegetables, needed a certain amount of protein, but I could focus on all of the really, really rich ones. And ironically, a lot of them were very similar anyway, from having celery to mushrooms to... There was many different ones that just fell onto that good list that I found worked from lots of pricking my finger with ketone tests. And then once I dialed in that plan and wrote it down and committed to it, I was able to drop another 20 pounds in the month, about 10 kilos. And I went from 88 kilos to 77. And then I decided it's time to have a little bit of a break and enjoy that I've just entered the normal weight range for someone that doesn't have much muscle mass, which is me, and just have a bit of a break. And I've been maintaining that now for about 3 months. And now I'm planning of maybe dropping a little bit more, but that's just purely to give myself a bit of a buffer room.
So I'm curious to know about calories during that period of time. So you don't like it. I call it energy density. But where are the calories during these 3 phases for you?
Okay. I'll explain. It sounds really funny because it sounds extremely low, like I should be starving. So at the normal level, when I'm eating to what I call maintenance, which is my normal diet, it averages out, depending on how I feel, between 1,800 to 2,100 calories. And and that's just how it averages. And, some days I feel like more macadamias, other days I don't. Sometimes I pile in a lot more, and weight stays the same. But now, as I get near the end, I've had to drop down the fats a little bit. And then that level just falls just under 500 calories, which sounds really, really low. But I found if I drop the fat intake down from a lot of those online ketogenic calculators down a 25% deficient or around about that level, I hardly made a difference. It'll just go down a little bit, and then my body will find some sort of homeostasis and will go up again, and I still would maintain that same level of fat loss each week and get discouraged. So I just took a hammer to it and made it a lot lower and checked my blood ketones and my blood sugar, and I could see that it was my body fat actually burning through there. I still had the same satiety feeling, there's still the same mental focus, there's still same zero hunger, because I was in that fat burning mode that I adapted to.
So you dropped your carbs, dropped your fats, you maintained adequate protein.
Yeah. So my protein level never changed. It was still pretty much exactly the same as it was previously. My carbohydrate content was still pretty much the same as it was previously, because that carbohydrate insulin load was still low enough for me to access my body fat, which I could prove from being able to produce blood ketones. And then just by dropping the other exogenous source that creates more ketones, I was able to force that more plate fat. So even though it sounds like an excessively low calorie intake, the other calories were just getting produced from all of my fat triglycerides. So I still felt awesome. I still felt full. And many people experience that exact same sensation when they do fasting. So if you look at their total energy expenditure, it still continues to rise, even though they're not accessing it from the food that they eat.
You feel euphoric because you've got this mental state fueled by ketones that you feel fantastic even though you're not eating very much, because you can access your body fat. But one of the concepts in one of those knobs is insulin load, and a lot of the time I think people interpret that to really high fat, but potentially if you drop the carbohydrates and maximize nutrient density, you don't end up with a very, very low protein approach, because higher protein foods are very highly nutrient dense at the same time. So really, for most people, dropping the carbohydrates, you don't need to run away from protein particularly. I think that's something people get lost in, and protein's so controversial, and people are very extreme in that. And really maintaining muscle mass is really important in that weight loss phase.
Well, this is really challenging to some of the people from outside our community, that total energy expenditure actually increases Can you talk just a little bit more, explaining the mechanisms?
Yeah, I suppose I gathered a lot of data from different people on ketones and glucose just to see, and found that different people have different metabolic types. They have different gradient between their ketones and glucose. So somebody who's insulin sensitive, it has a very flat line and can easily produce ketones. But I took that data and plotted it, that I talked about in the talk yesterday, with ketones versus plus glucose. So what you end up seeing is when someone like Simon is fasting, he ends up with very high ketones and low glucose, feel on top of the world because you've got all this ketone circulating. But I think a lot of people think that someone who is metabolically healthy has high ketones. Therefore, if you just eat more fat, more NCT oil, more bulletproof coffee, like I've served you this morning, you end up with the same effect. And I think potentially lots of people get in trouble with that because they end up with a lot of energy circulating in their blood, and then the body sees that regardless of whether it's ketones or glucose, and says, well, I've got too much, I need to bring that back down to a maintenance homeostasis sort of moderate level. And actually whether the fat, the insulin turns the fat to body fat, I think potentially it'll just take the glucose and put that into body fat to mitigate those high energy load. And I think, like, if you think of a caveman trying to survive the winter, sitting in the cave, he doesn't want to be burning a lot of energy. He wants to be sitting there at a really low energy level. And then when, saber-toothed tiger comes up behind him, and he's got to be able to explode and get away and be able to mobilize energy really quickly. So they go from a very low energy state to a really high energy state, and you can mobilize your liver glycogen and your body fat to ketones very, very quickly. And these are the metabolically healthy people. So regardless of diet, they're really people that are incredibly, the Olympic athletes, really well-trained athletes, they're burning a lot of body fat, and then they just add glucose on top of that and can explode and really mobilize it very quickly. So I suppose looking at that total energy concept, you train your body to be more metabolically healthy when you drive your total energy down. You track your blood glucose as it drops. And I think blood glucose rather than ketones is maybe even a better measure. So if you've got high blood glucose, you need to find a way to drop that, and fasting is a good way to do that. And as you deplete your blood glucose, you start tapping into ketones. But you may not actually show high ketone levels on your Freestyle Neo or whatever, because your body's actually using them efficiently. But if you then, blew into a ketonics, you may actually show high acetone levels because you're actually metabolizing that fat for fuel. So that's really exciting.
Well, we did some experiments.
You were the guinea pig.
Yeah.
We were very bored on the cruise.
We have a ketonics here, but it takes too long. But you can, we've already did the little video about my particular results, but basically you were saying, and we demonstrated that the beta-hydroxybutyrate doesn't correlate with acetone.
Yeah, and what we found with you, and it was similar with our daughter, who's 12 and healthy and eating not a therapeutic ketogenic diet, but a lower carbohydrate diet. She's got you and her, and I've got low glucose, moderate ketones, not high ketones. I mean, my daughter had quite low ketones, but then blows red on the ketonics because you're actually burning the fats. So yesterday after a meal, I blew a red 4. And this morning there were 4 red flashes again. And
I don't normally check, and again, I've been doing this for 16 years, and I'm not a data geek, so I'm just touchy feely, and it's working.
15 years and a low carb, and, calcium score of 0.
Yeah, you can do it without spreadsheets.
Yeah, no, and personally, like I checking ketones is expensive, and it's all a bit nerdy, but it's interesting to biohack and learn about your body, so you can then tweak it. But I don't think most people should really bother checking ketones regularly, because it can be really expensive and you get neurotic, and really you just need to get to a point where you enjoy food, enjoy life. Don't be, so neurotic. Some people get. But one thing I have found, and one blog post on the blog that's been really popular, how to use your glucose meter as a fuel gauge. So actually going, well, is my hunger real? I check my blood glucose. Is it lower than it usually is? Yes, I need to eat. No, I don't need to eat. And then you can actually use that to drain your glucose stores. And once you drain those glucose stores, it forces your body to tap into your fat stores. Insulin drops, and you improve your insulin sensitivity and metabolic health.
So the future, Simon, you did all this without exercising.
Yes, I did that on purpose, just to prove to myself that it is possible. Plus, my wife was newly pregnant and she had the baby all during the time when I started that. And because of the complications with the pregnancy, she didn't want to change the diet her diet at that time while she was pregnant in case that there was any issues. So I was cooking my own meals, managing a new baby that came on the scene, and yeah, it was many hours with a newborn. So it was just easier just to focus solely on nutrition and see how far can I go by just tweaking my nutrition.
Yeah, and if we can say your age.
I'm 33.
Yeah, so it's just interesting, and so you're gonna continue with what you're doing, see if it's working, tweak it if it's not, and essentially in the maintenance phase, when everything's good, and you said you had a goal to maybe lose a little bit more weight.
Yeah, just for fun, but it's just to give me wiggle room. It's time to start ramping up the exercise now because my wife's saying my arms are looking a bit weedy, so no shoulders. So
you're doing great. You're coming out of your shell, as we found out on the low carb cruise. Just meeting everybody, you were initially quite nervous to interact with the community, but
then he was up doing karaoke with Jimmy Moore doing "Can't Touch This." It was hilarious.
May that never see the day of the internet.
No, it will. It'll go viral.
So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerber.